When Formula 1 regulations change, some teams get it right and some teams get it wrong. You could have a new team challenging for wins, you could have a new team on the podium, you could just have a general mix-up of the standings, or you might have a team come from nowhere to win the actual championship. Braun in 2009, Mercedes in 2014, Red Bull now. It's happened a few times in recent memory, but sometimes people will build the right car, but it might end up having a few shortcomings, let's say. And that's exactly what happened with Adrian Newey's last McLaren, the MP4-20, which I'm guessing is also Snoop Dogg's favourite car. So the changes to the 2005 season are well documented. It was that one tyre set per race rule that if you find someone who liked that rule, they're lying. The so-called Ferrari killer rule set because Michelin definitely had the upper hand when it came to making durable tyres, capable of making it to the end of the race with enough life left to go quickly, if that makes any sense. Probably from all of that endurance racing that they do. There were some conspiracy theories at the time that Michelin had developed some sort of rubber that messed around with Bridgestone, some sort of chemical compound that allowed fellow Michelin tyres to grip well and the Bridgestones to not have said grip. But there are some more realistic claims, such as Bridgestone doing most of its testing with Ferrari at places like Fiorano, which meant that Bridgestone had tested Bridgestone on Bridgestone, if that makes any sense. So when they got to a race weekend, 70% of the field was on a different brand of rubber. But that myth is debunked, if you want to call it that, when you find out that the entire GP2 grid ran on Bridgestones. So at more than a few Grand Prix, there'd be way more Japanese rubber on the track than French. Plus also at the 2005 San Marino Grand Prix, Schumacher was catching up to Alonso at a rate of knots, so look, Bridgestone just dropped the ball that year, really. But other than the tyres, the FIA had changed some of the rules because they decided that the 2004 cars were too quick and they needed a little bit of reeling in. Chief among which of these rules, along with the tyres, was the raising of the front wing, which, when you look at it, it doesn't really seem that difficult of a change and that difficult to get around things. But as the designers from Newey down quickly realised, they had to make sure the air going over the car from this point was as clean as possible, because if any wake turbulence passes over the rest of the car, you won't get any of the desired effect, and the bits you spent millions working on won't work properly. And in the early fluid dynamics simulations, this kept happening. The air was coming off the end plates, hitting the lower wishbone, and just creating one big piece of aerodynamic noise. So Newey came up with an idea. Raise that lower wishbone by about 120mm or just under 5 inches from where it was originally going to go, because the FIA had said they had to raise it by 50mm to start with. So the one end was connected to the car at a position more level with the centre line of the front axle, while the other end was at the lowest point the FIA allowed. Where it was tied off is a stiff mounting anyway, and wouldn't upset what is normally a very stiff part of the car in the first place. Win-win. Now Newey actually came up with this idea while he was on holiday in Barbados, which left his then wife and kids a little bit miffed that Dad was working when he should have been spending 10 days by the pool. When he got back to England, McLaren had basically fixed the problem because he'd been sending ideas through fax and email from his hotel in Barbados, which is just peak Adrian Newey really, but they also started raiding the design sheets of the MP4-18, which was that failed McLaren project they had going in 2003 I think it was, and the MP4-19, the previous year's car, to see what they could carry over, because this whole thing was more of a total redesign for this new rule set than it was an upgrade of a previous model. Another thing they were able to do because of a gaping hole in the rulebook was to have this little U-shaped pocket in the middle of the front wing, because the rules said only the end plates or words to that effect had to be raised from what was there before. There was this little bit in the middle that was exempt from the rulebook, and all the teams used this gap to have a certain portion of the front wing lower than the rest of it to try and claw back some of that downforce that had been lost through the rule change. It meant that the FIA's rule change to try and combat the dirty air coming off the cars and allow the cars to overtake hadn't worked. The cars came back in 2005 dirtier than they were in 2004. Just FIA things. McLaren also shortened the wheelbase of the car because that worked better with Michelin's tyres, and also put the other required bits and pieces on the car to make it fully legal with what the FIA wanted for 2005. Smaller diffuser, rear wing moved forward on the car, that sort of thing. But they also added these horns to the car, which apparently were there to try and direct air to the rear wing, but I've also read bits and pieces that say they didn't actually do anything, but were there to trick people into thinking that they did something. Now you might be thinking, Aidan, what does Adrian say in his book? But I've been through this, and the chapter on the MP4-20 has more to do with him joining Red Bull than it does on the actual car, so I think I'm going to be raiding other parts of the internet for facts and figures here. But one thing that the MP4-20 had versus its rivals was a pretty powerful engine, something that made that Brazil special from a couple of years ago look like the engine from the first car Carl Benz built. The F0110R, which isn't an engine, it's a Wi-Fi password, was the last V10 engine to be put into a McLaren, and it pumped out a mind-boggling 930 horsepower, or 695 kilowatts, at 19,000 RPM. And it sounded a bit like this. The engine was an improvement power-wise from 2004, and Mercedes had been struggling a little bit for power for some time, something that can in part be traced back to the death of Ilmor co-founder Paul Morgan in a plane crash in 2001. Mercedes had put more money into the engine, and Martin Whitmarsh had been in that department too, making sure that whatever engine Mercedes and Ilmor came up with fit the McLaren like a glove. Oh, and this engine now had to last 2 weekends, not 1. And Whitmarsh had to shut down rumours that McLaren had somehow shaved 50 kilos off the overall package. His engine department, Mike Coughlin's mechanical direction, and Newey's aero. He said the claims were very wide of the mark. But while this engine was incredibly powerful and able to get you back from the Delta Quadrant in less than 70 years, there was one small drawback. It tended to eat itself alive than do much else, and during testing, Kimi Räikkönen and Juan Pablo Montoya replacing Coulthard, who had gone to Red Bull, had a few problems. The problems started in testing, but then when the season got going, both McLarens lost part of their aero and then had to slow down to preserve the engines. Räikkönen had also stalled his car at the start of that race in a double case of bad luck. In Malaysia, Montoya would be fourth as he tried to adapt to the new car, while Räikkönen couldn't score points due to having to pit for a puncture. Both McLarens would be in the points at Bahrain, with Pedro de la Rosa replacing Montoya because JP was out injured. Injured from playing tennis, and then in the following race at Imola, Räikkönen's drive shaft went while Wurz and the other McLaren would be third. They weren't qualifying too well either. At Australia they were 9th and 10th, Malaysia 6th and 11th, Bahrain 8th and 9th, but by Imola, Räikkönen had bagged a pole position. This being because the car was too lenient on its tyres to start with and couldn't warm them up properly. But Imola, Barcelona and Monaco were all pole positions, qualifying sessions where the one-lap pace of the McLaren was clear to see. While Räikkönen did retire from the San Marino Grand Prix, he won at Barcelona and Monaco to get some decent points on the board. But this great run was undone at the Nürburgring where he flat spotted one of his tyres, and due to the rules, he couldn't change it. So he kept on going until the final lap when the car suspension gave out because of the vibrations. This is when the FIA said, okay, if your tyre is damaged, you can change it. But just that one, and you've got to prove that you have to change it. Kimi would then win the Canadian Grand Prix before the shambles that was the round at Indianapolis. He then had to take a 10th-place grid penalty when his engine failed in practice at Manicourt and would then finish second behind Alonso. Silverstone, another retirement. Oil leak, which led to engine failure. In Germany, his hydraulics went for the third retirement from the lead that season, but he would win at the Hungaroring with Montoya retiring, and then reports went around saying he'd leave McLaren if the reliability wasn't fixed. Also at that same race in Hungary, he became the first person to win the race after having the worst qualifying. Basically, back then it was one-shot YOLO qualifying. You went out one at a time and did a lap. But because Räikkönen had retired in Germany, he had to go out first for the Hungarian Grand Prix, so he went out when the track was at its cleanest. So he was the first person to win a race after going out first in qualifying. Yeah, it's complicated, but that's a free stat right there. Räikkönen would then win the Turkish Grand Prix before being handed another grid penalty for the race at Monza, in which he'd initially qualified first. He'd finished fourth in the end. A win at Spa netted him another 10 points, but it was all for nothing really, as Alonso had secured the title at the following round in Brazil, with Montoya winning the race and Kimi finishing second. In Japan, Kimi went on an absolute charge, starting 17th and winning. But the championship was over. And this paragraph, because I've done the race in full before. In all, the MP4-20 won 10 races that year. The Renault R25 in the hands of Alonso and Fisichella won 8. Yet Renault won the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship. It was the 1967 Lotus 49 of the modern era. Raikkonen retired from at least 3 races while in the lead, and then had all those grid penalties at other rounds. So it just couldn't do what the car was designed to do, or what the car could potentially do. And that 67 Lotus 49 was exactly the same. When it worked, it dominated, but it just kept on breaking down. So in the end, Raikkonen just lost far too many points to Alonso. Along with the 49 in 1967, it's probably the fastest car to not win the Constructors' Championship. The following year, the FIA would change the rules to allow pit stops again, and McLaren slipped back a little bit further as Ferrari got back to the front. The wait for that first driver's title would still continue for another few years, until 2008, while the Constructors' drought continues, and has been doing so since 1998. But it's one of the most incredible pieces of F1 machinery ever built, and had it worked, it would have been the perfect car to see out the well-loved and much-missed V10 era. So then, a dive into the history of the McLaren MP4-20. Whether it's a /20 or -20, you decide. If this has been something that's taught you something new, or at least cleared up some bits and pieces up for you, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed with that bell on so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks to the kind folk at Patreon and the channel members for the continued support. If you want to help out on a more personal level, there's a link to Patreon down in the description, and the buttons for memberships and super thanks are down there too if you just want to donate or join in however you want. Also in the description is a link to Discord and my socials if you just want to connect that way. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.